Next, from Springfield, we sit down with Brooke Simpson, author of Ulysses S Grant, Triumph Over Adversity, 1822 to 1865. This runs about 40 minutes.
Brooke Simpson, thanks for joining us on the Illinois Channel.
Glad to be here.
You are the author of Ulysses S Grant, Triumph Over Adversity, 1822 to 1865. Ulysses S. Grant was arguably one of the most famous people of the 19th century, and yet today a lot of people probably have heard of him, but maybe really don't know a heck of a lot about him and why he matters so much. Why does Ulysses S. Grant matter?
Grant's a key figure in American history in the 19th century. He's the general that brings the Civil War to a successful conclusion for the United States. Later he serves 2 terms as president at a time when the nation was trying to come back together and try to find a path towards racial justice for the recently freed African Americans. So he's a key figure. People realized that at the time. To some extent, they still understand that today.
Grant was born where?
Grant was born in Point Pleasant, Ohio in 1822. He was the son of a businessman, a tanner, Jesse Grant. Point Pleasant is just off the Ohio River. Moved to a little town, Georgetown, and grew up there in Ohio. When he was a young man, at 17, he goes off to West Point, the United States Military Academy, graduates in the middle of his class in 1843. Several years later, participates in the Mexican-American War and acquits himself well under fire. Marries Julia Dent, slaveholder's daughter, lives in Missouri, south of St. Louis. They'll have 4 children over the course of their marriage. 1852, he goes to the West Coast. He misses his wife, his first and second born sons. In 1854, resigns from the Army, returns to Missouri, tries his hand at a number of business enterprises. He's not very successful, in part because of his health and in part because of the economic conditions of the country at that time with the Panic of 1857. Moves to Illinois in 1860, goes to Galena, northwest corner of the state, to work as a clerk in his father's general store, and that's where we find him when the war breaks out in 1861.
I want to spend more of the time, obviously, on his career and his successes as a general, which, but on one hand, it seems to me it might be that Grant could apply to people today, because as your book says, triumph over adversity. Grant did okay in the Army. He, as you say, went to West Point and fought in the Mexican War of the 1840s. He, on the other hand, when he left the Army to come back, didn't like being separated from his family, had a good decade of his life where it was just a struggle for him, or 8 years or so where it was an extreme struggle, barely getting by, failing time after time at different venues. And then it seems as if the war breaking out between the states is what really saved him. When he went to his father's place in Galena, it was really more, wasn't it, out of desperation that he had basically failed at everything else, and so his family kind of gave him a job just to, so he could feed his family at that point?
He struggled at all sorts of occupations when he was in St. Louis. He worked his in-laws' farm for a while. That didn't work. He was a real estate agent for a while. That didn't work. All sorts of things just didn't work for him, in part because I don't think he was a very sharp businessman. He was too trusting and sometimes too gullible. So yes, in 1860, something he never thought he would do, he went to work for his father, and his father thought, well, I'll bring him in the business, but he never saw in his son the future businessman that he saw in his other sons who were also in Galena. So it was a humbling experience for him to go to Illinois.
So he comes to Illinois, and when is that, 1859?
1859, 1860. So he's certainly working at the store at that time with the election of 1860.
And then at some point he actually comes here to Springfield. Then he goes to the old state capitol. We're just about a block or two away from the old state capitol. And he seeks a commission to kind of get back into the Army. Who did he talk to, and how did that go?
When the war breaks out in April 1861, people do realize that Grant has military experience, including his hometown congressman, Elihu B. Washburn. Grant drills a company from Galena, accompanies them down here, and then seeks jobs out helping the war effort, works in the old state capitol, filling out forms, helping to organize Illinois forces for the war. He is looking for a commission. He thought that perhaps given his military experience he might be fit to be a colonel. But he didn't have a lot of luck at first, though Washburn lobbied for him a little bit, and he got to know Governor Richard Yates. It's only when there was an unruly Illinois regiment that was almost on the point of mutiny against its colonel that Grant was called to head the 21st Illinois.
And because of all of his career, we're going to have to move fastly through it, and obviously people hopefully will pick up your book and get all the details. But one of his early victories, and Grant really had pretty much a succession of victories, but was at Fort Donelson, right? Mm-hmm. What was the Battle of Fort Donelson, and how did he showcase his talents as a commander at that early battle?
Fort Donelson, the Confederates build a brace of forts where the Cumberland and Tennessee rivers cross from Kentucky into Tennessee. In February 1862, Grant moves down with a naval flotilla supporting him to take those forts. And Fort Henry, the first falls without much opposition on February 6th. In fact, the Navy actually captures Fort Henry. Then Grant wires back to his superior officer, Henry Alec, that he'll go across and just take Fort Donelson. Well, that proved a little harder nut to crack than Grant had anticipated, and that, in fact, at one point the Confederate forces, seeing themselves surrounded by Grant's men, tried to break out a surprise attack that at first caught the Union forces off balance, caught Grant off balance. Grant was visiting his naval counterpart, who was recovering from a wound suffered in the bombardment on Fort Donelson. Grant came back, seized the situation up very quickly, ordered other commanders to counterattack, reasoning that the lines must be weakly held elsewhere, while rallying his men, understanding that it was an escape attempt, not an attempt to win a battlefield victory, and push back. So this is a case where, faced with chaos, defeat, rout, he was able to take stock of everything and rally people and get the job done. And when the garrison at Fort Donelson surrenders, it's the largest surrender of enemy forces to an American general up to that time. And he had demanded of the fort's commander the unconditional and immediate surrender of that post. Northern newspapers grabbed a hold of that, looked at those first two initials, U.S., called him Unconditional Surrender Grant. And though he's a pipe smoker, during the battle he directs his forces using the stump of a cigar, and Americans looking to pay tribute to their new military leader deluge him with boxes of cigars, and he becomes an inveterate cigar smoker. Cigar smoking, that of course contributed to his throat cancer late in life.
Yeah, I guess he would smoke, he would almost chain smoke cigars, I think, during the war, would he not?
Yeah, there's a story that during the Battle of the Wilderness, the first engagement he has in Virginia, that he leaves headquarters in the morning with 24 cigars in his pocket. At the end of the day, he's talking to another general. He decides to offer him a cigar, and he finds he only has one left. So I think the cigars acted as a sedative, calmed him down. Often he could retreat into his private thoughts while he was quietly smoking.
The character of Grant, there's a kind of a dichotomy. On one hand, we have this man who had leadership capabilities, as you alluded to in the Battle of Fort Donelson. I guess calm under pressure, persistence. On the other hand, there's some question about, was he an honest man? Questions come up in the Presidency, which is going to be in Volume 2 of your book. Mm-hmm. Was he an honest man? Was he a drunkard? How smart was he? When you analyze him as an individual and the qualities of his personality, what are his weaknesses and what are his strengths?
Well, I think he is an honest individual, honest to the point, again, of being gullible and naive at sometimes, because he trusts other people because he thinks they'll act upon the same understanding of what's good and honest as he does. As far as alcohol goes, Grant clearly has what I think we'd call a relationship with alcohol. I think it's debatable as to whether he was alcohol dependent or an alcoholic. He himself reflected that sometimes he could consume a significant quantity of alcohol without having it show any impact at all, any effect. Other times, one drink, and he would show the effect a great deal. I think in the 19th century, the issue is not whether men drank, most men did, but whether they could so-called hold their liquor. And Grant could not always hold his liquor, and I think that's where the issue of his becoming a drunkard comes.
That was more when he was, I think, in the state of Washington, wasn't it? When he was separated from his family? Or was
when he was on the West Coast, that first became an issue. And it probably contributed to his resignation from the Army in 1854. He had a superior officer out there with whom he did not get along, and alcohol, I think, played a role in that decision to resign. But a lot of that drinking can be attributed to both loneliness and the fact that he wasn't feeling well. And that's another thing we overlook when we look at the 19th century. Alcohol is the remedy for everything. And for Grant, it was a really unfortunate remedy because he suffered from migraine headaches, and people would suggest that he drink to take the edge off the headache. Actually, that's the worst thing you can do when you have a migraine headache. And so there are times that we know that Grant's not feeling well, he takes a drink, and actually it makes things worse. So I think the reputation as Grant being a drunkard is greatly overblown. On the other hand, those historians and biographers who deny that Grant had a relationship with alcohol that was often detrimental to his career, I think they're wrong as well. The charge you could always bring against Grant was that he was a drunkard. And how could you trust the lives of Union soldiers to such a man? And that dogged him for his military career. It's something that his superiors, including Abraham Lincoln, were intensely interested in finding more out about, whether this man could control himself if you're going to allow him to control armies.
Was there ever any example of him being, during the Civil War, was there any example or questions about whether he was drunk on duty?
Critics would raise these allegations. They raised them after Shiloh. Someone raised them in northern Mississippi in September of 1862. But there's no evidence that alcohol impaired his ability to command on the battlefield. Alcohol may, on the other hand, have contributed to some other incidents, including an accident in New Orleans in September 1863, in which his horse threw him, and there's some speculation as to whether Grant had mounted this rather lively horse in less than full sobriety, let's put it that way. And when you're the commanding general, though, even if the battle isn't on, you still have to be ready to do things. And every once in a while, I think you could argue that Grant, even when things seem quiet, you always have to be ready in case something happens. That happened to Grant several times, after all, Donelson, Shiloh, and other places. And so I think the argument that, well, when Grant drank, it's when it was safe to do so, I think that's overblown, because in some sense it's never safe for a commander to be incapacitated when he has such responsibilities on his shoulders.
The Battle of Shiloh in Tennessee came 1862?
That's correct.
And what was that, a success or a failure for Grant?
A little bit of each. Confederate forces after Fort Donelson gathered to drive Grant out of western Tennessee before other Union armies can reinforce him for an invasion of Mississippi. And they attack in the early morning hours of April 6th, 1862. Union forces are not prepared for this attack. They have not been fortified. They're raw troops. Grant has been drilling them, teaching them how to load and fire their weapons. So there are a lot of soldiers out there who've never seen combat before.
They're basically just farmers who volunteered. Right?
That's correct. So a lot of raw troops. The Confederate assault is successful at breaking those Union lines, driving Union forces from their camps back to a steamboat landing. Grant, who was not present at the battlefield at the beginning, he had put his headquarters elsewhere because he was waiting for the other generals to arrive, comes on the field, starts rallying his men, feeds ammunition, anticipates reinforcements, and by the end of the day, the Union forces have staved off a final Confederate assault. Next day, reinforced, Grant counterattacks and drives the Confederates back. So on one hand, looks like a victory. On the other hand, the casualties at Shiloh, more than Americans had ever seen before, shocked, mortified the American public. People looked for someone to blame, and Grant was a target of such criticism, and not entirely unjustifiably so. That after all, it had been his negligence and the negligence of others that had put Union forces in a precarious position in the first place. So there was some argument about replacing Grant or putting him aside. His superior officer, Henry Alec, comes down and shells him by making him second in command, but with no actual responsibilities in that position. And Grant, for a while there, looked like he might just fade out of the war, having been a flash in the pan.
Yeah, I was going to say, didn't some people talk about having him fired because of the casualties?
Yes, I mean, and understandably so, again, that these casualties were tremendous. Americans were not used to having such quantities of bloodshed. By the end of the war, they understood that Shiloh, while horrific in terms of its human cost, paled besides other battles that took place during the next several years of conflict.
When we go into the war, both sides thought this was going to be a relatively quick battle. And in fact, famously, people from Washington at the first Battle of Bull Run rode out to watch it almost as if it was a sporting event, and then saw the Union forces routed and people, the spectators as well as the Army, the Union Army, fled in terror, running back to Washington, basically. So in 1862, they still had not, as you mentioned, been really accustomed to this level of violence. No one in the history of the United States thus far in any of our wars where they had incurred so many people being killed, nor had the battles really been fought, except in the Northeast, going back to the Revolutionary War, on American soil. So here we had these battles destroying American property, farms. It would come to destroy cities, such as Atlanta. But as the war progressed and Grant was fighting in the West, Lincoln was obviously back east in Washington, went through a series of commanders. He said a lot of them had the case of the slows, that they just wouldn't seek out the enemy and take the battle to him. Was that Grant's greatest tribute as a general, that he wasn't afraid to fight and that he was dogmatic about taking the battle to the enemy?
I think Lincoln and others appreciate that Grant was an aggressive general, that Grant took the initiative, that Grant understood that there were moments in a battle where who moved first, next, would get the upper hand, and he was determined to be that person. So Lincoln observed that when it came to actual fighting, Grant was somebody who would do that, and that wasn't always the case with his generals elsewhere.
When you investigate as a biographer someone's life, so how would you assess a Grant? In other words, in terms, was he a great strategist? Was he a great tactician? Or was it merely that he was the dog that wouldn't let go of the cuff and just kept doggedly bringing the battle to the South and wearing them down?
I think he was a fairly able strategist. I think he knew how to move armies around on a map. I think he understood logistics very well. He had been a quartermaster, a commissary officer during the Mexican-American War, so he understood the importance of supply for his army and the importance of denying logistical support to the enemy army. So in that sense, I think he understood war very well. Tactically, he was not nearly as skilled. Most 19th century generals, most Civil War generals, in fact, were not. And I'm not sure that was all terribly important, because most Civil War battles were, in fact, bloody slugfests in which the victor suffered just about as much as the defeated. I think Grant's determination, perseverance are characteristics that many people highlighted at the time. I also think that one thing, though, that separated Grant from a lot of his contemporaries was his ability to work with his civilian superiors and understand the larger issues of the war. That Grant, who originally had been hesitant to strike at slavery because it was an institution that if attacked would embitter white Southerners and draw out the war, by the middle of the war he understands that attacking slavery is attacking the foundation of the Confederacy. It's essential for victory. Using African Americans in the ranks of the Union armies increases the size of those armies and to some degree their effectiveness.
Was he in favor of that? Was he in favor of bringing the Negro to the battle?
By 1863, he is an advocate of enlisting African Americans in the armies of the United States, so he is certainly in step with administration policy. I think the other thing, though, that you got to appreciate about Grant during this time is he does know how to work with the boss. He does know how to write letters to Lincoln to reassure him what's going on, keep him informed. He understood the pressures under which Lincoln was operating, and he understood also how to deal with Lincoln's concerns. Lincoln, for example, was concerned about whether any of his generals might be a potential political opponent in the election of 1864. Grant understood this. So he made sure to send letters through intermediaries that stated his lack of interest in pursuing a national political career, that all he wanted to do was fight the war out. He made sure that Lincoln saw those letters and reassured Lincoln that could support Grant and forge a command team that proved essential to Union victory.
One of the biases that everyone who reads history has to contend with is we know what happened. And yet you have to read history with the understanding of looking at the decisions that were made in the context that those people making those decisions at that time did not know what was going to happen. They didn't know the outcome. People think today, well, of course the Union won the war against the South. There was the Battle of Shiloh, which, or not Shiloh, but Vicksburg, which Grant, a siege he laid to Vicksburg, starved the population out. And it was one of the great victories that followed the day after the great victory at Gettysburg. So you had on July the 3rd, 1863, Gettysburg. On July the 4th, 1863, Vicksburg surrenders to Grant.
Correct.
Those two victories, it seems to me, really gave President Lincoln the political muscle that he needed to continue on to be his reelection. That, am I right that those victories are what started to turn the attitude of the American people that yet maybe we can win this, maybe we can hold the Union together, and maybe this immense loss of life is going to be producing the fruits of victory?
Well, I mean, that's, I think, what we see in hindsight, but it's not clear that that was the case.
Well, and I wanted to say in that, how close did we come as the Union? How close did they come to losing the war?
I think they came very close, and I think, in fact, the closest they came was during 1864. That'd be after Gettysburg and Vicksburg. Well, Gettysburg is primarily important for stopping Lee's invasion and at high cost to both armies. To some extent, the Army north of Virginia never recovered from the extent of the casualties it suffered at Gettysburg, not only in terms of its men, but also in its command structure that had finished months of decimating Confederate commanders, starting with Lee's Lieutenant Stonewall Jackson at Chancellorsville. So I think it costs a lot. But in the aftermath of that battle, when George Gordon Meade, at the head of the Army of Potomac, pursues Lee, but not as energetically as some people would have liked, people see Gettysburg as a missed opportunity. When Lincoln goes to Gettysburg in November, the Gettysburg Address, he talks about the unfinished work before us, that there are things we need to do. And so Gettysburg is seen as important, but a missed opportunity that could have been even more important. Vicksburg, on the other hand, I think for all the talk about dividing the Confederacy in two and taking 30,000 Confederates off the board, is really important because it solidified Grant's standing. People stopped whispering quite so much about Grant. They began to understand that whatever their previous doubts, he was a very successful commander. And among those people was Abraham Lincoln, who began to see in Grant now the general who might just be able to win the war. But I think even in 1864, with Grant as General-in-Chief, after a spring of bloody campaigning in Georgia and Virginia, with Union armies seemingly stuck outside of Richmond, Petersburg, Atlanta, Lincoln himself fears for his reelection chances. In late August, he actually writes a memorandum, folds it up, asks his cabinet members to sign it without reading the contents of the memo. The memo says that he thinks he might lose the war. And he's certainly going to lose the election, is what he thinks. And he's trying to commit them. In fact, if we lose this election, we have to try to win the war, because if my opponent becomes president, I don't think we're going to win this conflict. We see Lincoln as a very astute political operator, a man who understood public opinion and the temper of the times. If Lincoln thought that he was going to be defeated in 1864, he must have had some good reason for believing that.
Lincoln in 1864 runs against McClellan, who had been the initial general leading the Union forces. And McClellan, as I understand it, the policies would have been that keeping the South isn't worth the slaughter of so many Americans. He was more the peace candidate. Is that a fair assumption, or is that a misunderstanding?
That's a misunderstanding of George McClellan. It's not a misunderstanding of many of his supporters in the Democratic Party, including the Copperheads, who were very much opposed to the prosecution of the war and adamant in their opposition to emancipation. McClellan himself was pledged to carry on the war. He did not have the commitment, however, that the Lincoln administration had to the destruction of slavery. McClellan didn't like slavery, but he didn't see that the war measures of the Lincoln administration were actually constructive. Lincoln's point was not that he thought McClellan would sue for peace, but that rather McClellan would have gotten victory with the support of people who would have sued for peace, and McClellan would find himself in an untenable position if he did not heed their advice. So I think we can understand that George McClellan was not advocating a peaceful settlement that recognized an independent Confederacy, but many of his supporters did believe that that was the way to go.
I'm going to rush through the end of the war here. So after Vicksburg, is that what really sealed the deal as far as Lincoln selecting Grant to become the leader of the Union forces?
That and Chattanooga, and at the same time Lincoln's assessment that in the Eastern Theater, that while George Meade was a capable commander, Meade was probably not tough enough or able enough to defeat Robert E. Lee.
Much of the battles, you have Sherman taking the South, dividing the South. As Vicksburg gave the Union forces control of the Mississippi, so Texas, among the other Confederate states, were isolated from the rest of the Confederacy. Sherman's going down to the sea, his march to the sea, and divides the Confederacy again. But you then have Grant in much of 1864 battling around Richmond. One of the battles that people look at, and one of the criticisms of Grant, was Cold Harbor. And they basically would be saying that this shows that Grant is just a butcher, that he didn't really care about human life. What happened at Cold Harbor that brought about that criticism? After all, he had seemed to prove himself a good general up to that point. And to what extent is that a fair criticism or not?
Well, Cold Harbor is the culmination of the first 40 days or so of the, really the first 30 days of the overland campaign that Grant conducts against Lee in central Virginia in 1864. So for about 30 days, Grant and Lee are going head-to-head with the Wilderness, Spotsylvania, tremendously bloody battles for both sides. Grant is convinced by the beginning of June, as his men are now approaching the outskirts of the Confederate capital at Richmond, he's convinced that the Confederate Army is about to crack, that they've shown signs that perhaps they're no longer the fighting force they once were. There was some truth to that, but it could be exaggerated, and it certainly was. At the same time, he had a command problem, and that George Gordon Meade actually retained field command of the Army of the Potomac. Grant accompanied Meade, but Grant, in fact, was the commander-in-chief, the general-in-chief of all the armies of the United States. And so he supervised Meade. Sometimes Meade thought it was a rather uncomfortable, too close supervision. But in fact, Meade in late May basically asserted command of the Army again. And Grant let him because he felt that Meade knew the generals in the Army of the Potomac better than Grant did. It was Meade who was actually in operational command of Union forces at Cold Harbor. We know this, in fact, from Meade's own correspondence with his wife the day after the battle. He proclaimed that he was on command. He was in command of the field all day, and Grant just visited him a few times. What happens at Cold Harbor, it's a bloody repulse. The Union forces did not attack in coordinated or cooperating fashion. The Confederates were well dug in. They had become masters at field fortifications and making them in a fairly short period of time.
So the Southern forces were mostly fighting a defensive battle, right?
By this time, but they had set up a position where they could lay down a lethal fire on advancing Union forces. And again, the Union forces had not scouted the terrain, they had not reconnoitered it, they did not act in cooperative fashion, and so the assault was a disaster. But in terms of what we know about Cold Harbor, the losses became greatly exaggerated. We know from recent studies that about 3,500 to 4,000 men probably fell in those assaults. That's regrettable. But it's about half as many men as fell at Pickett's charge on July 3rd, 1863. So if Grant's a butcher, then what do we call Lee? What's interesting, though, is that in the aftermath of this futile assault, and it was futile, Grant himself expressed in his memoirs regret that he'd ever ordered the last assault because it could do no good, and he regretted the bloodshed. Cold Harbor assumed mythical proportions and became, in the minds of many people then and now, to represent the entire campaign, to the point that you have stories of 7,000 men falling in 20 or 30 minutes. That's been discounted, but sometimes Grant found myth hard to shake. Again, the myth that he was an alcoholic, the myth that he was a butcher insensitive to the suffering of his men and the like. So Grant remains, in the popular mind, a lot of times a fairly misunderstood person because these myths proved durable, even if their factual basis was less than firm.
So the war basically comes to an end in more or less April of 1865. There were still some Confederate, after Lee surrenders, there's still some Confederates fighting in the field. Mm-hmm. I believe the very last battle was in Texas or so around June of 1865, if I recall. But basically, for practical purposes, it ends. Lincoln is assassinated, Andrew Johnson becomes president. Reconstruction, we could spend obviously hours on all these topics. But it leads to, and I just want to get to actually what is going to be your next book, what happens after the war's end. Grant becomes president in 1860, elected in 1868. He's reelected in 1872. I told you off camera before that I was surprised to learn until just recently, I had not been aware that he sought the presidency again in 1880. And I thought it was that he had not really enjoyed the presidency. So to what extent did Grant enjoy being president? And if he didn't enjoy it, why did he seek the presidency again in 1880?
Well, I mean, I think we're talking about three separate situations. In 1868, Grant runs for president because he feels obligated to, that he believes.
Was there a clamor for him to run?
There's certainly a lot of talk about him becoming president, a man who could solve problems, a man who could bring peace to the nation, bring order, protect African-American rights and the like. People placed tremendous expectations on him, and he made it clear to others, including Sherman, that he felt that it was his duty to run in order to preserve what he called the fruits of victory. And he wanted to make sure that political wrangling did not sacrifice those results.
And the country was really torn apart at that point, right?
Yes.
I mean, they tried to impeach Andrew Johnson, and you still had this divide about how to handle the victory of the Civil War and which the policy positions, because obviously we didn't have Lincoln there to guide us through the Reconstruction period.
Right, and much like George Washington had to serve in President to sort of solidify what he had accomplished by being a victorious general during the American Revolution, Grant felt he had to do the same sort of thing. In 1872, I think Grant, understanding now he was the target of partisan attack, some fair, some unfair, sought re-election in part as a form of personal vindication and went so far to mention that motive in his second inaugural address. So I think then he wanted to win badly. In 1880, he'd gone around the world on a trip after he left the White House in 1877. I think he began to see the Republican Party was once again in trouble. His friends told him that he could win renomination easily and that he could run for a third term. Grant wasn't so sure, kept on pressing his advisors, are you sure that I can get the nomination? It's going to be much of a struggle. I don't think Grant would have wanted that nomination nearly as much as, let's say, he wanted re-election in 1872. But he did think that he still had a role to play. So did he like being president? Not really, because he came under more criticism during that time of his life than at any other. But did he feel a sense of obligation and duty? Yes. And that led him to make some interesting decisions that were not always the decisions he would have made if he just consulted his personal desires.
Time grows short, and we could talk much longer if we had the time, but we should mention, so your book that we've been primarily talking about, which was published in 2000, and to good reviews, Grant, Triumph Over Adversity, 1822 to 1865. You're now working on the second volume. And again, what is the title?
Ulysses S. Grant and the Fruits of Victory, 1865 to 1885. So we take the story from the end of the war to the end of his life.
And where would you imagine you're in what process? Are you writing? Are you still researching? Or where are you?
I'm mostly writing now and framing chapters and writing. I've done most of the research. Every once in a while you find something and you might want to go back to an archive to check a few things or explore a new collection, but the research is basically done. And the argument of the book is that we should see the last 20 years of Grant's life as a unified whole, in which Grant tries to define what does Union victory mean. First as a commanding general during Reconstruction, then as 8 years as president, and then even as personal memoirs, telling the story of the war from his perspective to try to say, this is what we tried to achieve and this is what we did achieve.
And you imagine in a couple of years that'll be out?
I certainly hope so.
When you look back overall, how do you not fall in love with the individual that you're researching, because you spend so much of your own personal life as a biographer with this individual? How do you maintain the objectivity as a biographer, as a writer of history, to assess the qualities, and to what extent is this person someone who should be lauded, and to what extent should they be critical?
I think you have to remember you are not that person. That your mission as a biographer is not to rehabilitate. It's not to rescue. It's not necessarily to denigrate either. Your obligation is to try to understand somebody as a human being, warts and all. And as you point out, and I've said this before, it's really bad business to fall in love with dead people. It's also, by the way, bad business as a biographer to have such vicious hatred for somebody that you can't draw back. But I view this more in terms of an umpire or referee at a sporting event, baseball, hockey, whatever, and saying, okay, you've made a mistake here. I will call them as I see them. And I think Grant's mistakes are just as instructive in understanding the man as are his successes.
When we read your biography, we can do it as readers over a relatively short period of time. You will have spent years with this person. Does Grant hold your attention, or is there some point where it's a labor where you have to force yourself to continue to mine this, plow this field of research and write about him?
Well, I think I took a break in part after the first volume because I did want to get away from Grant, and because it seemed that now, after I had written some books on Grant, all of a sudden became a popular and, in fact, safe topic for some biographers. And we've had several biographies of Grant come out, very highly laudatory. They laud him a great deal, let's put it that way. The laudatory accounts, I think, also praise him for good intentions, praise him for being on the right side of history and the like. I think in many cases are insufficiently critical of his shortcomings and are a little too enamored with this theme of rehabilitation. So I wanted to get some distance away from Grant. I had other projects in which I was interested and pursued. And I wanted to do a lot of thinking about how I would deal with those last 20 years because I know that second volume is going to be seen by many people as my last word of Grant.
Well, Brooks Simpson, it'd be great to talk longer. Maybe we can do that again, but we appreciate you taking the time to talk to us today.
I'm glad to be here. Thank you.
Thank you.